and happy International Women's Day. Welcome to Figments, the Power of Imagination. This is still season one. Not sure when that'll end, but it's episode 4, and I still haven't been canceled. There's our reminder of what we're doing here at Figments. I want to entertain, and I know this episode will do that, and inspire. We're going to talk about a big idea, not a small figment, but a big idea, and that's a sustainable, inclusive society, especially with regards to security, the world I kind of grew up in. And but you'll still hear about some amazing dreams that have come true, some figments that have led to an incredible life, because my guest is my great friend, Dr. Alan Ravette, and she's coming to us from Vancouver, Canada. Are you there? Hola.
I am.
There you are.
Sweet. How are you doing, Fig?
Great. It's so good to see you.
It's always good to see you.
So you know what happened to me. I got involved in women, peace, and security at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and not accidentally, because equal rights were always a core value for me, at least internally and eventually externally. And as I learned about the UN Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security, and learned more about the value of inclusiveness, it became a thing. And through that thing, we met in Washington, D.C. Thank God. So I should probably give your bio, which will take the entire 30 minutes. And then, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take up any time on your bio except this. You became a medical doctor at age 21. In the middle of a civil war, you started a voice for Libyan women in war-torn Libya. And you've only been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice, once by the government of Sweden, once by Canada. I just checked my resume 0 times so far. So please don't complain to me that you were not yet selected. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Fig?
I'm good. You have an incredible background. And I do want to say, for those who are watching, you maybe know me as a hard-nosed fighter pilot. The reason I care about women, peace, and security is not because I'm politically correct. I don't like that concept of being politically correct. I like to be practically correct and do things that work, and inclusiveness works. And if there's anybody who's made it work through extraordinary influence in the United Nations and elsewhere, it's you. So my first question for you is a simple one. Who do you think you are? Superwoman?
It's an interesting first question.
Of course.
First, it's been incredible to be able to actually work with you through this entire journey. I remember when we first met, I think like 5 or 6 years ago now.
7.
7?
I checked.
It's been 7
years?
No,
6. You're right, 6.
Yes. See, of course, I'm usually right in this friendship. No surprise there. But but when we first met, I remember the very first conversation we had was actually about that practicality part. It was about that, not necessarily this pie in the sky vision of, okay, let's talk about equality, which is incredibly important. But it was more about, let's talk about the empirical evidence. Let's talk about the reality that not only does this exist, but that there are fundamental things we could change structurally, politically, socially, that actually make it much more effective. And I found our conversation, I remember when we first met, to be one of the most rewarding, because it was one of the first times where we were talking about things that were rooted in evidence. This wasn't a question of like, do you think this is the right thing? Do you think this is a good thing? I mean, I think we'd be pretty hard pressed to find people who say, listen, I don't think everybody is entitled to and should have a dignified and equal life. But I think what was different was this conversation around, okay, where is the evidence, and where can we build on that, and where can we amplify those who are already championing it? And I think that's really kind of where that connection first started.
Yeah, and we'll answer your question if I may interrupt, and I'm sure I'll be scolded later, and that's fine.
Yeah.
That conversation built a sort of shared approach uh, that allowed us to do a lot of things in front of audiences and see two really different people, because we're two really different people, very different backgrounds. You, a Libyan Canadian from a huge family, me, a cheesehead from Wisconsin from a huge family, but slightly older and a kind of a very traditional white America background. I'm not apologizing for that. It's my background. But we did find a lot of commonality.
Yeah, and different ways of looking at the world, I think, is pretty critical, even now.
Yep.
I think one of the most true things is oftentimes the way we are raised and our experiences shape the way we see the world today. And I don't think it's ever been more true for two people than it is for you and I, because I've had some of the most difficult conversations with you, from everything to,
You're welcome.
to inclusive security and women's rights, to things like faith and abortion. And we've had really intense conversations on politics. And across them all, I think the reason we've been able to have those difficult conversations and walk away, not necessarily having changed each other's minds, but at least having understood each other's perspective, is because there is that underlying respect, right? There is that underlying appreciation that we've both been in contexts that have shaped our worldview in specific ways. And I do think, given how different our oftentimes our political viewpoints are, or our social viewpoints are, it's been one of the most beneficial things in this increasingly polarizing time to have someone who has fundamentally different views than me that I can go to and say, why is this a thought? Like, how does this make sense? Help me understand the perspective. And that's been really enriching. And I think one of the challenges when it comes to women's inclusion, and we see it today, for example, is because it's International Women's Day, a lot of different companies will have their International Women's Day post on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. And a lot of them will run a commercial. And a lot of them will, for one day, celebrate women.
For one day.
For one day. But none of their policies, none of their business process, none of their leadership, like, it's all quite superficial in that it really doesn't delve into a lot of the structural challenges. And I think until we can start having those more difficult conversations with people who disagree with us, where we both sit at the table and hear each other out, we're just going to get a lot of kind of like Band-Aid solutions and superficial posts. And that goes for women's equality. That goes for across the board on issues of equality, without a doubt. And I find it a little frustrating that we can't have those conversations.
So I'm politely raising my hand, so I'm not interrupted, because I've played my one interrupt card. I think part of what you've described is, and I don't know that we're that different in a lot of areas, but there are areas where we diverge significantly.
Yeah.
And it's not just respect for each other, which we have, but it's kind of respect for human life, for people.
Yeah.
And we've both seen the worst of times in conflict. I had a talk with a young person in my life the other day about what matters, color of skin. When you look at the color of skin and react reflexively, or the color of blood. And I couldn't be a medical doctor because I do react. What matters? What really matters is that people are people, and anytime you demean or diminish their ability to contribute to life, you're not doing well for you or your society. And so, and to go back to what you said about International Women's Day posts and slogans and banners on websites, put your money where your mouth is, please. And I saw, as I get ready for this,
put your money where your mouth is, but also put your like, actually challenge your systems of power. You know what I mean? Like, these companies will be like, we believe in diversity, and they'll hire like a couple of women in the bottom 30%, and then the management is all still the same, right? And so I think it's, yes, put your money where your mouth is, but also really challenge the existing systems of power. Be comfortable and be prepared to get out of the way. It's going to be necessary. Be comfortable and be prepared with very difficult conversations. I mean, you're talking, when we talk about, for example, racial inequality, especially this past year in the US, how many conversations have centered not those who have been oppressed and suffering, but have centered those in systems, those who hold power and those in systems of power. I think it's disingenuous to say that we're realistically going to be solving for things like poverty and things like economic equality and things like gender-based violence and even health equality if we're not going to start talking about how structures and systems are set up and who benefits from them.
So we're completely off track. Of course, this is absolutely not a surprise, and I'm going to go with what I told you we'd kind of close with first before we take a short break. You've said that men need to address how they've benefited from these white men, implied, systems of power, which a lot of white men would kind of have, a lot of men would have a reflexive, visceral response to. So as I read that and thought about how our audience might look at it, it reminded me of something one of the professors at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies said as we were going down the path of women, peace, and security. And Dr. Bill Weiniger, to give him credit, said, men need to get uncomfortable or get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I really do think that's right. Because guess what? Everybody who is disadvantaged, diminished, discriminated against is feeling pretty uncomfortable all the time.
Yep.
So if we don't like that itchy feeling, that's a good thing. Yep. And it will help us participate in making change, because inclusion, I think you and I agree, in fact, I'm sure of it, doesn't mean you exclude a previously advantaged group to include another group. It means building a truly sustainable, inclusive society.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think first, I love that statement about it's important to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think that's incredibly true. I think one of the biggest challenges is the assumption that the pie gets smaller, right? So if we have more inclusive processes, then automatically that means your seat at the table is gone. And I think one of the most important ways to translate this to people is we're not saying, let's have women at the table when it comes to peace processes at the exclusion of men. We're saying that if it's not representative of the societies it governs, it's not going to work. No policy will, right? And that does mean having an inclusive process that includes women, that includes asking not only about women, but about men as well. Do we have representation across socioeconomic status? Do we have representation of race? Do we have representation of disability, of different, different realities and experiences that people have that shape what they bring to the table, right? And unfortunately, oftentimes we don't. Even when we do have, more inclusive processes, more gender inclusive processes, they tend to reflect a particular subset, right? And until we are, I think, a lot more prepared and comfortable to start asking, okay, who is sitting at the table? Why are they sitting at the table? What qualifies them to be there? It'll be really difficult for us to change the makeup of that table. And the best example I can give, I remember I got into a heated debate once. With somebody. Yes, you would be surprised. A very heated debate because, he brought up the quote by Ruth Bader Ginsburg of like, when will, there be enough women on the Supreme Court when there are 9? And he brought it up as like an example of how women are trying to take over. And I was confused by that because I was like, there's never been a problem. You've never looked at 9 men on the Supreme Court and been like, this is fundamentally wrong. And if you don't share that outrage equally, then I can't necessarily trust that you are really here for equality. Like it shouldn't feel uncomfortable to you to even suggest that what exists now is not how it should exist. And she was using it really as an example to illustrate. So, I mean, there's so many examples of how we tokenize women's leadership, how we tokenize particular women leaders, how we attempt to create role models instead of, structures that can support women to
Mhm.
not only exist but thrive in spaces of leadership and power, in a way that isn't necessarily true for men. And it can be anything from, I've told you this story before, but sitting in a meeting and you know, having to feel responsible for not only being the only woman there, but being told clearly by mentors of mine that when you walk into a room, people are going to see first and foremost that you're a woman, um, that you are visibly Muslim, that you are not from here, and my mentor joked and said, and that you're young, but don't worry, you'll age out of that one. And I know that walking in, I have to know my stuff an extra 50%. I have to show up early. I have to answer every question. I cannot leave any doubt in anyone's mind that I'm qualified to be there in a way that a lot of my male counterparts don't have to. They get to be
So,
accountable for just themselves, not entire
so
communities.
your male counterparts should have to feel that way.
Well,
They
I think
should
they should.
feel
Yes,
equally obligated to do the right thing, do their job well, be
100%.
present, be prepared. And that's one of
100%.
the things we saw at APCSS when we normalized participation of women in the courses by increasing it to not just one in a seminar, but 25% and now beyond, is that everybody feels obligated to perform,
Exactly.
not just a token woman. And to men, I'm going to work in this episode's What Would Fig Do? Right now, I'll tell you what I do when I talk to groups, especially in the military where I can be nice and blunt, is I walk in the room and look at the demographics and I address the problems I see. Not enough women, not enough color, whatever it is. And what I tell them is you should all be uncomfortable with this. We, in the matter of security, those who defend security, who make the policy that addresses security, have to reflect the people, the population that they're defending. I'm going to take a quick breath here, if I may. We are so off track, and we could probably go for an hour. And if we could bring up this slide that shows the future episodes. We've skipped right over some great pictures. Okay, that's what we've got coming up. In 2 weeks, we'll have Susan Helms, Air Force 3-star general, retired, and the record holder, tied for the longest spacewalk in history. So she must be an astronaut. Incredible human being. And then 2 weeks later, we'll talk to some cancer survivors about the figment of recovery that kept them alive, that they met. And I've already mentioned our friends on previous episodes, my friends from Hollywood who bring figments to life on the screen. And all of those are going to be fun, but this is cutting into our time here. So I am going to get in one thing that I meant to show at the beginning, and that's this isn't the first time we met, but we went to speak at Camp Smith about women, peace, and security and inclusive security. And I drove my Mustang, which is pretty badass, just to call it what it is. And you liked it. And so you wanted to drive it. So could we roll the movie clip of Allah and the Mustang? Get on it. Oh no, never mind. There's cars up here.
And it's red.
Okay, so as we saw, she's very competent with a stick in a 550 horsepower supercharged Mustang GT, which, by the way, is 12 years old today, I think. I really do think this is the anniversary of the purchase. But as we were turning onto the highway, or a place where she could have maybe put a little more pedal into it, the light turned red. And she said, and it's red.
It was
So
disappointing.
yeah, it isn't, but it's a good metaphor because nothing slows you down.
Oh,
You've
okay.
done so much. You like the way I mean, nothing slows you down. You started as a medical doctor. You got interested in the voice of women in conflict. You came into the UN world. You've done incredible things, but how do you keep going? Why are you not satisfied with accomplishments that would fill a lifetime for most people? It's
Um,
our time to inspire.
it's our time to inspire. I don't really see them as accomplishments. I think a lot of the work, and I'm sure you probably share this as well. A lot of the work that I've done has been what I felt was necessary and where I felt I could be of service. And I do think a huge part of it is my faith. Um,
Hmm.
I I grew up in a my parents are devout Muslims. I grew up in a Muslim household and really fell in love, I think, with the hospital because the hospital was a place that felt spiritual and holy to me in a way that even, the mosque didn't, no church, no synagogue, no,
Hmm.
house of worship has ever felt. I would go to the hospital and I would see people of all faiths or of no faith in the same chapel and having conversations. And I think seeing just the humanity in each other. And for me, that has always been a guiding light. I have a kind of um, not as comfortable a relationship with organized faith, but with organized religion, but with that sense of personal faith and this belief that God only puts you in places where you can be of service or where you will learn, right? Like where you can help or where you can learn. And that you are accountable to do one of the other, right? And that every space that you occupy is not because of your superior knowledge or
Hmm.
strength or
Hmm.
but it's because of your privilege and it's because through you great work can be done or great lessons can be learned. So I think faith is probably has been for me at least a north star.
Yeah, I think for me too, faith is something that's grown over time, and what makes the figments become real. You have to have faith because at times you take significant risk. So, what's your current figment? What's next? What's your next amazing thing?
Oh, I don't have one. I really I became a mom last year
Yeah.
and that's been I think one of those moments where you learn a lot of lessons. um And I think it's, not to sound cliche or anything, but it's definitely shifted what I see as success in my own life. I think one of my figments is if, in a few years when my daughter starts school, her teachers say
Hmm.
she's a kind kid. That would be ideal. I think as my parents get older, a figment is to be there. This
Hmm.
past year showed me just, I mean, I think we forget as we're growing up that our parents are also getting older. And um, this past year was the first time in 10 years that I haven't been traveling for most of the year, that I've been able to
Right.
be with family. And so I think recalibrating where I prioritize my time is a figment of mine these days. Um, I think shifting the conversation we're having around gender equality and around health security is probably a big one. This
Is
notion that
shifting
you,
it in what direction? What would
well,
you? How would you like that conversation to change?
well, now the conversation is okay. Let's deal with the pandemic, or let's deal with security.
Hmm.
And you've been in these rooms as well. Let's deal with
Yeah.
security, and then we'll deal with equality. And I think anybody who's looked at the data or who has been in scenarios of insecurity knows you can't do that. It's not an either or, it's a both and. You have to be looking at issues of equality when you are solving for security, because the solutions for inequality have to be built in, right? And they can't be an afterthought. And I think really, with COVID, a huge part of this has been like, okay, well, gender based violence is at an all time high. Women's economic exclusion is rising. We know that we've set back gender equality by a generation at least, right? And so the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to say, okay, let's solve for the pandemic and then let's solve for economic recovery and then let's talk about gender equality? Because I just think we need to reframe the conversation to say you can't have those two without the third. You can't have economic recovery without women's inclusion. You can't have security without really having conversations around why a lot of women didn't felt less safe at home than they did from a pandemic. Those are conversations we need to be having now.
So how do we not have it set back a generation? If that's where we think we already are
I
with
think it comes
women's equality, that has to be how do we practically address that as men and women? How do we address that
It
right
comes
now?
back
What do
to
we
your
do? Tell me what to do.
it comes back to your earlier question though about how do
Yeah.
we, when we're talking about being comfortable with being uncomfortable, it comes back to your
Hmm.
question of where whichever space you occupy, whether you are a commander in the military, whether you are a doctor, whether you're a parent, whether you're a high school teacher, it doesn't matter. Whatever space you occupy, in that space you do hold power. You hold influence with particular people, you hold power with particular people. And it is saying leverage whatever space you occupy, whatever sphere of power, to ask these questions, to say, okay, hey, where are the women if you're a CEO or if you're a military commander? Or are, in class, ensuring that when we're talking about girls' education, the
Yep.
percentage of girls aren't decreasing because of other, familial responsibilities or social responsibilities. Or you are asking in your local community, how are we supporting women who don't feel safe at home? But leveraging the power that you do have. And to go a step beyond that, sharing that power and saying, in your position, okay,
Hmm.
I'm going to find ways to share the resources I have, the knowledge I have, the networks I have, the credibility I have, and the power I have to amplify another voice, to ensure that somebody's invited into the room that isn't in the room right now. So I think that's where it starts, to be quite frank. And if we all do that from parents to CEOs and prime ministers and presidents, then we will have that representation in the room. Then we will be having those difficult conversations. But this assumption that only certain people are responsible
Hmm.
and accountable is, I think, what sets us back, because
Uh,
we all need to
I
be
like
doing
that.
it.
I told you we'd wish we had more time, and we'll do this again. We'll do it personally and maybe back on Figments. I couldn't agree more. And for all the folks who feel uncomfortable, okay, welcome to the club. I recognize, though, that taking the time to be inclusive, to be practically and sustainably inclusive, is going to be better for you. So go ahead and be selfish. It's going to make your company, your university, your government, your military better, more effective at what they do. It's going to make it a safer place to live. So it's not like you're giving something up, you're making things better. Allah, it's so good to see you. Give my best to your family. I miss them too. It's
It's
been
always
since your
good to see you,
wedding
Fig.
since I saw them. So
That's true.
we'll all get together again soon. And thanks for being the incredible human being you are, and a perfect exemplar for International Women's Day.
Thank you, Fig. The
So
feeling is mutual. Not the International Women's Day part, but the perfect
yeah,
exemplar of leadership, and my love to your family as well.
thanks a lot. That's it. This is a wrap on our episode 4, Figments. Join us in 2 weeks, and please click like or whatever it is you're supposed to do in the virtual world. Aloha.